Elena Whitmore felt the cup slip from her fingers before she understood why her chest had gone cold. The wine spread across the marble floor of the palace hall like a dark red shadow, and somewhere above her, Prince Adrian was smiling. Not the smile she had fallen in love with 3 years ago. A different one, a satisfied one. Her wedding gown, white and gold, was the last thing she saw clearly before the world tipped sideways, and the guests around her turned into a blur of shocked faces and startled screams. She tried to say his name. Nothing came out. The last thought in her mind was simple and bitter. He had planned this from the very beginning. Then she opened her eyes to candlelight. She was lying in her own bed, in her own room, in her father's house in the city of Evermore. Her hands were young again, unmarked by the rings she had worn as a bride. Outside her window, servants were calling to each other about the banquet preparations for that evening. Elena sat up so fast her head spun. She knew this night. She remembered it from 3 years ago, back when it had happened the first time. Tonight was the royal ball where she would meet Prince Adrian for the first time. Tonight was the beginning of everything that had eventually killed her. She pressed a hand to her chest, half expecting to find blood, but there was nothing there, except her own frightened heartbeat. A second chance. She did not know how it was possible, and in that moment, she did not care. She only knew one truth, clear and unshakable. She would not walk toward that man again. Her maid, a cheerful young woman named Bridget, knocked and entered with an armful of gowns. "My lady, your mother wants you dressed within the hour. The whole city will be at the palace tonight." Elena stared at the gowns without seeing them. In her first life, she had chosen the blue one, the one that had caught Adrian's eye across the hall. This time, she pointed to a plain green dress instead, one she had never worn to an important event. Bridget blinked in surprise but said nothing. By the time the carriage rolled up to the palace gates, Elena's stomach was tight with nerves. She kept telling herself this was only a ball, that nothing terrible could happen tonight, that the real danger was years away, but knowing the future did not make her calm. It made her watchful. Every guard, every noble, every servant, carrying a tray of drinks, seemed like a possible thread in the story she was trying to escape. Her parents walked ahead of her into the grand hall, greeting old friends, discussing marriages and trade and land, the way nobles always did. Elena hung back near the entrance, scanning the crowd. She spotted Prince Adrian near the throne, dressed in deep blue and gold, laughing at something one of his officers had said. He was exactly as handsome as she remembered, exactly as charming, and exactly as dangerous, though nobody else in that glittering room seemed to know it. She turned away before his eyes could find her. That was when she heard the commotion near the side entrance, where the guards usually let in merchants and messengers. A thin, ragged man had collapsed just past the gate, and 2 guards were dragging him back toward the street, unwilling to let his shabby clothes touch the polished floor of the palace. "He fainted, sir," one of the guards said to a nobleman who had paused to watch. "Some traveling healer. Says he was called here to treat a servant's injury, but he's in worse shape than the patient." Elena did not know why her feet carried her toward the commotion, instead of staying safely near her parents. Perhaps it was the memory of her own death, still fresh in her mind, making her feel strangely brave, as if nothing in this life could frighten her as much as what she had already lived through once. She pushed past a cluster of curious guests, and knelt beside the fallen man, before anyone could stop her. He was young, though exhaustion and hunger had aged his face beyond his years. His skin was pale, his lips dry, and his hands, when she touched them, were trembling from more than just fear. A leather bag lay beside him, spilling small bundles of herbs and folded cloth bandages across the stone. "Bring water," Elena said, her voice sharper than she intended. When no one moved fast enough, she repeated it, louder. "Now." The guards exchanged uncertain looks, but one of them finally hurried off. Elena loosened the collar of the man's worn shirt and pressed her fingers gently against his wrist, feeling for his pulse the way she remembered a physician once teaching her father's household staff to do. It was there, faint but steady. "He needs food and rest, not a lecture on manners," she said to the gathering crowd, several of whom were murmuring about the impropriety of a healer collapsing at the palace gate. "Does anyone object to a man being kept alive?" Her tone silenced them. When the water arrived, she helped tip a little between his lips. His eyes fluttered open a moment later, dark and startled, focusing first on the crowd of curious nobles, and then, with visible confusion, on her. "You fainted," Elena said simply. "You are safe." "I was called here," he said, his voice hoarse. A servant girl cut her hand on broken glass. "I came as quickly as I could, but I had not eaten since yesterday morning, and the walk from the lower city." He stopped, embarrassed, and tried to push himself upright. "Don't," Elena said, pressing a hand lightly to his shoulder. "Sit still a moment longer." Behind her, she heard her mother's voice, tight with disapproval. "Elena, what are you doing?" She stood to face her mother, aware of the many eyes now watching the Marquis' daughter kneeling in the dirt beside a common healer instead of mingling with dukes and princes. In her first life, she would have flushed with embarrassment and hurried away. Tonight, she simply lifted her chin. "He collapsed from hunger while trying to help someone in this palace," Elena said. "I would think that is worth a moment of my time." Her mother's mouth tightened, but a nobleman nearby, an older man with kind eyes, chuckled quietly. "The girl has more sense than half this hall," he murmured to his companion, just loud enough for Elena to hear. The young healer managed to sit up fully now, leaning against the wall, still pale but steadier. "Thank you, my lady. I did not mean to cause such trouble." "You didn't," Elena said. "What is your name?" "Julian," he answered. "Julian Ashworth." The name meant nothing to her, and yet something in the quiet, careful way he said it made her pause, as though there were more behind it than a simple introduction. She pushed the thought aside. It was likely nothing more than exhaustion making her imagine things. "Rest here a while, Julian Ashworth," she said. "I will have food brought to you." She turned to a passing servant and gave quiet instructions, then straightened her gown and walked back toward the hall, aware that she had just drawn far more attention to herself than she had intended on a night meant for quiet avoidance. Several nobles were still watching her, whispering behind painted fans. Somewhere across the room, she felt rather than saw Prince Adrian's gaze land on her for the first time. In her first life, that gaze had felt like the beginning of a dream. Tonight, it felt like the closing of a trap she had only barely managed to step around. She did not look toward him. She kept walking, out through a side door into the palace gardens, needing air, needing distance from the man whose smile she now knew to fear. The gardens were quieter, lit by lanterns strung between the trees. The music from the hall softened to a distant hum. Elena sat on a stone bench and pressed her palms against her eyes, trying to steady her breathing. She had done it. She had avoided the first meeting, or at least delayed it, and in doing so she had spent her evening kneeling beside a stranger instead of dancing with a prince. It should have felt like a victory. Instead, her hands were still shaking. Footsteps approached along the garden path, unhurried, careful. She looked up, half expecting a servant sent to fetch her back inside. Instead, she saw Julian, still pale, but walking under his own strength now, a small bundle of bread wrapped in cloth, held loosely in one hand. "I wanted to thank you properly," he said, stopping a respectful distance away. "Most people would have stepped over me and gone on with their evening." "Most people are wrong to do that," Elena said. He studied her for a moment, his dark eyes thoughtful in the lantern light. "You speak plainly, my lady. That is rare, in a place like this." "I've had enough of pretty words that mean nothing," she said, before she could stop herself. It was truer than he could possibly know. Julian tilted his head slightly, curious, but he did not press her. Instead, he glanced toward the bright windows of the hall behind them. "You should return to the ball. A night like this does not come often for someone in your position." "I know exactly what a night like this brings," Elena said quietly, more to herself than to him. Then, louder, "But you're right. I should go back before my mother sends the entire guard to find me." She rose from the bench, smoothing her skirts, and found herself studying his face once more, searching for whatever it was that had caught her attention earlier. Nothing marked him as anything more than what he claimed to be, a tired, hungry, kind young healer who had walked too far on an empty stomach. And yet something in her instincts, sharpened by a death she still remembered in vivid detail, told her that this chance meeting in the garden was not as small as it seemed. "Will you be well?" she asked. "Better, thanks to you," Julian said, and for the first time, a small, genuine smile crossed his face, one without the polish of court manners, or the practiced charm she had come to distrust. It was a simple smile, and it warmed something in her chest that had gone cold the moment the poison touched her lips in another life. "Then I'm glad," she said. She walked back toward the palace doors, leaving him standing among the lantern light and quiet trees. Behind her, the music swelled, and somewhere inside that glowing hall, Prince Adrian was likely still watching the entrance, waiting for the girl who, in another life, had once walked straight into his arms. Tonight, she did not. Tonight, she had knelt beside a stranger on the palace steps instead, and something about that small, ordinary choice already felt more important than anything the prince could offer her. She did not yet know why. She only knew that for the first time since waking in her own bed with a second chance at life, she felt something close to hope, small and fragile, but real. As she stepped back into the noise and light of the ball, she cast one last glance over her shoulder toward the garden. Julian was gone, slipped away into the night, like a man who did not belong to grand halls and golden crowns. And yet Elena could not shake the feeling that their paths had only just begun to cross, and that this quiet, tired healer was going to matter to her, far more than any prince ever had. She squared her shoulders and walked back into the crowd, ready to face whatever the rest of the evening, and the rest of her second chance at life, had in store for her. 3 days after the ball, Elena found an excuse to visit the lower city for the first time in her life, without a chaperone hovering at her elbow. She told her mother she wished to buy fabric from the weavers near the Eastern Market, and in a way, that was true. She simply did not mention that her true destination lay 2 streets past the weavers, in a narrow building with a faded wooden sign that read, Ashworth Healing House. The lower city was nothing like the quiet, orderly streets of the noble district. Carts rattled over uneven stones, vendors called out prices for fish and bread, and children chased each other between the legs of tired workhorses. Elena pulled her cloak tighter and kept walking, feeling both nervous and strangely alive. In her first life, she had never once set foot in this part of the city. She had spent that entire year preparing for a marriage that would end with her own death. She found the healing house exactly where a passing baker's boy had directed her, tucked between a cobbler's shop and a small chapel. The door was propped open, and through it, she could hear a child crying and a calm voice speaking in low, soothing tones. Inside, Julian knelt beside a boy of perhaps 7 years old, gently wrapping a bandage around a scraped knee, while an older woman, likely the child's grandmother, wrung her hands nearby. Shelves lined the walls, crowded with jars of dried herbs, rolled bandages, and small clay bottles. The room smelled of mint and something faintly bitter, like willow bark. "There," Julian said to the boy, tying off the bandage with practiced fingers. "Keep it dry for 2 days, and you'll be running circles around your friends again." The boy sniffled but managed a small smile. His grandmother pressed a few coins into Julian's hand, murmuring thanks, and led the child out past Elena, without seeming to notice her at all. Julian looked up, and his expression shifted from professional calm to open surprise. "My lady, I did not expect to see you here." "Elena," she said, "please. I think we're past titles, after the other night." He rose, wiping his hands on a cloth at his belt. "Elena, then, is something wrong? Are you hurt?" "No, nothing like that," she said quickly, suddenly aware of how strange her visit must seem. "I wanted to see that you'd recovered well, and I confess, I was curious about your work." It was not the whole truth. The whole truth was harder to explain, even to herself. She had not been able to stop thinking about him since the garden, not in the way she had once thought about Adrian's handsome face and easy charm, but in a quieter, steadier way, as though some part of her recognized in him a safety she had never found anywhere else. Julian studied her for a moment, clearly unconvinced by her explanation but too polite to say so. "Well, you've caught me at a rare quiet hour. Would you like to see how the healing house runs?" She spent the next 2 hours following him through his small world. He showed her the herbs he grew in a narrow garden behind the building, explaining which ones eased fever and which ones stopped bleeding. He let her help grind dried chamomile into powder for a woman suffering from headaches, guiding her hands with patient instructions rather than simply doing it himself. When an elderly man came in complaining of a cough, Julian listened carefully to his chest, asked thoughtful questions, and prescribed a warm tea with honey and a few days of rest, refusing payment when the man admitted he had little to spare. You don't charge everyone, Elena observed, once the man had gone. Everyone deserves care, Julian said simply. Coins are useful, but they aren't the reason I do this. Elena thought of the physicians who attended her family, men who demanded gold before they would so much as look at a patient, and felt something warm settle in her chest. Where did you learn all of this? A flicker of hesitation crossed his face, there and gone so quickly she almost missed it. Here and there, he said. I've traveled quite a bit, picked up knowledge from different healers along the way. It was a vague answer, and Elena noticed it, filing the small oddity away without pressing further. She had learned, in her first life, that pushing too hard for answers people were unwilling to give often did more harm than good. Julian would tell her in his own time, if there was more to tell. She returned to the healing house the following week, and the week after that, until her visits became a quiet, regular part of her life. She learned to identify a dozen different herbs by scent alone. She learned how to clean a wound properly, how to recognize the early signs of fever, how to speak gently to frightened patients, so they trusted her hands even when they trembled. Julian was a patient teacher, never mocking her mistakes, always explaining the reasoning behind each remedy, rather than simply expecting her to memorize it. More than the lessons, though, she found herself drawn to the ordinary rhythm of his days. There was no scheming in the healing house, no careful political games disguised as friendly conversation. There was only work that mattered, done by a man who asked for nothing beyond the chance to help. Word of her visits reached her parents within the month, as she had known it eventually would. Her mother summoned her to the sitting room one evening, her father standing rigid near the window, his face carved from stone. You have been seen at a common healing house, her mother said, each word clipped with barely contained anger. Repeatedly, do you understand what people are saying about you? I understand that I've been learning something useful, Elena said, keeping her voice steady, despite the way her stomach tightened. Useful, her father repeated, turning from the window. Elena, you are the daughter of a marquis. There are certain paths meant for someone of your position, and consorting with a wandering healer from the lower city is not one of them. Prince Adrian has shown clear interest in you since the ball. Do you have any idea what an alliance with the crown would mean for this family? The mention of Adrian's name sent a cold ripple through her, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. I have no interest in the prince, she said. Her mother's eyes widened in genuine shock. No interest? Elena, do you understand what you are saying? Every unmarried noblewoman in this city would give anything for the attention he has shown you. I understand exactly what I'm saying, Elena said, and something in her tone must have carried more weight than her parents expected, because they both fell silent for a moment, studying her as though seeing a stranger where their daughter used to stand. This is not a decision you are permitted to make alone, her father said finally, his voice quieter but no less firm. You will attend the palace functions as required. You will be courteous to the prince, and you will end these visits to the lower city before they cause this family further embarrassment. Elena wanted to argue, wanted to explain everything she remembered from a life none of them could possibly understand, but she knew such an explanation would only convince them she had lost her mind. Instead, she chose her words carefully. I will attend the palace functions, she said, but I will not stop learning from Julian Ashworth. If that embarrasses this family, then I am sorry for it, but I will not pretend to want a life I do not want. Her father's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might forbid her outright. Instead, he simply shook his head and turned back to the window, a clear sign that the conversation, in his mind, was far from finished. Her mother pressed a hand to her temple and murmured something about ungrateful daughters before leaving the room entirely. Elena stood alone in the quiet sitting room, her heart pounding, and felt a strange mixture of fear and relief. She had expected worse. She had expected to be locked in her room, or threatened with disownment, as she vaguely remembered happening in some version of family arguments from her first life, though those had always been about far smaller matters. Perhaps her parents did not yet realize how serious she was. Perhaps they believed this was simply a passing curiosity that would fade once the prince paid her enough attention. She intended to prove them wrong. The following afternoon, she returned to the healing house as usual, half expecting to find a servant waiting to drag her home. Instead, she found Julian treating a young woman for a nasty burn on her forearm, the result of an accident at a nearby bakery. Elena helped fetch clean water and cool cloths without being asked, falling into the familiar rhythm they had built together over the past weeks. Once the patient had gone, Julian glanced at her, his expression unusually thoughtful. "You seem troubled today." "My parents don't approve of my visits here," Elena admitted, surprising herself with her own honesty. "They want me to spend my time at the palace instead, with the prince." Something flickered across Julian's face, gone before she could name it. "And what do you want?" "I want to be here," she said simply. "I like this work. I like feeling useful, in a way that has nothing to do with who my father is, or what marriage might benefit our family." Julian was quiet for a long moment, absently wiping down the wooden table where he treated his patients. "Your parents aren't wrong to want security for you," he said finally. "A healer's life is not an easy one. There is little gold in it, and less glory." "I don't care about gold or glory," Elena said. "I care about not wasting this life, pretending to be someone I'm not." The words carried more weight than he could understand, and for a moment, she worried she had said too much. But Julian only nodded slowly, as though her answer satisfied something he had been quietly wondering about. "Then I suppose you should keep coming," he said, a small smile touching his lips. "Assuming you don't mind further scandal." "I've decided I don't mind it at all," Elena said, and found, to her own surprise, that it was entirely true. Over the following weeks, their bond deepened in small, ordinary ways. He taught her to set a simple splint. She brought him bread from a bakery near her family's estate, insisting he eat properly instead of skipping meals while treating patients. They talked, sometimes for hours, about nothing important at all, the kind of easy conversation Elena had never once shared with Adrian, whose every word in her first life had felt, in hindsight, carefully chosen for effect. She noticed things about Julian that did not quite fit the picture of a simple traveling healer. Once, when a drunken man stumbled into the healing house shouting and swinging his arms in confusion, Julian moved to calm him with a stillness and control that seemed far too practiced for someone who claimed no particular training beyond medicine. Another time, she caught him reading a worn book late in the evening, its pages filled with old, formal language she did not recognize, the kind used in royal courts rather than common households. When she asked about it, he closed the book quickly and gave only a vague answer about a teacher who had once given it to him. Elena did not press him. She told herself it did not matter, that whatever quiet mysteries surrounded Julian Ashworth were his own business, and that nothing about him could possibly be as dangerous as the smiling prince she had once, in another life, walked willingly toward her own death. She was, in this at least, only partly right. For now, though, she was content. She had a purpose that felt genuinely her own, a growing skill she was proud of, and a friendship that steadied her in ways she had never expected. Whatever secrets Julian carried, whatever explained the small, strange details that did not quite add up, she trusted that time would reveal them eventually. She simply did not yet know how much that revealed truth would change everything. Autumn settled over Evermore, painting the noble district's gardens in shades of gold and rust, and still Elena found reasons to walk the 2 miles to the healing house nearly every day. What had begun as a quiet act of rebellion against a fate she remembered too well, had grown into something she genuinely loved, a life stitched together from herbs and bandages, and the steady presence of a man who never once asked her to be anything other than herself. At the palace, however, her continued absence from court gatherings had not gone unnoticed. Prince Adrian sat in his private study, a glass of wine untouched on the table before him, listening to his steward deliver a report he found increasingly irritating. "She has not attended a single function in 3 weeks, Your Highness. Her family claims illness, though the physicians report nothing of the sort." "And where does she spend her time instead?" Adrian asked, though he already suspected the answer. "A healing house in the lower city, Your Highness. Run by a man named Julian Ashworth." Adrian turned the name over in his mind, frowning slightly. In every calculation he had made since the night of the ball, Elena Whitmore had been meant to fall easily into his attention, as most noble women did. Her family's standing made her a useful match, her beauty made the arrangement pleasant, and something about the sharp, unimpressed way she had looked at him that first night had made her, unexpectedly, more interesting than the usual parade of eager young women who crowded his court. That she had chosen, of all things, a common healer over an evening in his presence, struck him as both baffling and faintly insulting. "Find out more about this Ashworth," Adrian said finally. "Where he trained, where he comes from, who his family is. I want to know what exactly has captured Lady Whitmore's attention so thoroughly." His steward bowed and hurried to comply, and Adrian returned his gaze to the window, watching the last golden leaves drift from the palace garden's oldest tree. He told himself his curiosity was purely strategic, a matter of understanding an obstacle before deciding how best to remove it. He did not examine too closely the small, unfamiliar irritation that came with imagining Elena's easy laughter, directed at someone other than himself. Meanwhile, in the lower city, Elena had begun noticing small things about Julian that refused to fit neatly into the story he had told her of his past. It happened first on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, when a merchant's guard, tall and heavily built, stumbled into the healing house cradling an arm bent at a wrong angle after a fall from his horse. The man was in obvious pain, and larger than either Elena or Julian by a considerable margin, but when he began to thrash and shout in his agony, nearly knocking over a shelf of glass jars, Julian moved with a speed and precision that startled her. He caught the man's flailing arm, at exactly the right angle, applying just enough pressure to still him, without causing further harm, his voice dropping into a low, commanding tone, entirely unlike his usual gentle manner. "Be still. I will not hurt you further, but you must stop moving." The guard, twice Julian's size, obeyed almost instantly, as though something in that voice demanded obedience in a way ordinary words could not. Elena watched, her heart beating a little faster, as Julian set the bone with quick, confident movements, before the guard even had time to tense against the pain. It was masterfully done, but what stayed with her afterward was not the skill itself. It was the brief flash of something controlled and precise in Julian's eyes during those few seconds, something that reminded her, uncomfortably, of the way palace guards moved when trained for combat, rather than simply for keeping order. She said nothing at the time, but the thought lingered. A week later, she arrived at the healing house earlier than usual, hoping to help prepare herbs before the day's patients began arriving. Through the half-open door, she saw Julian speaking quietly with a stranger she had never seen before, a man with a heavily scarred face and the careful, upright posture of someone accustomed to formal court. The stranger's clothing was travel-worn, but of fine quality beneath the dust, nothing like the simple garments most of Julian's patients wore. She caught only a fragment of their conversation before the stranger noticed her shadow at the door and fell silent. "Cannot remain hidden forever, my lord," the scarred man had been saying, his voice low and urgent. "They grow bolder with each passing season." "My lord." Elena's breath caught in her throat. She stepped back from the door before either man could see her clearly, her mind racing. My lord was not a term used for wandering healers. It was a term reserved for nobility, or higher. By the time she gathered her courage to enter properly, the scarred stranger had gone, slipping out through the healing house's back door, with a speed that left no trace of him beyond the faint sound of hooves in the alley behind the building. Julian was alone, sorting bandages with unusual focus, his expression carefully composed into its familiar calm. "Who was that?" Elena asked, unable to keep the question from spilling out. Julian's hands stilled for the briefest moment, before continuing their work. "An old acquaintance," he said. "He passes through occasionally with news from where I used to travel. He called you my lord." This time, Julian did look up, and something guarded crossed his features, quickly smoothed away. "A joke between old friends," he said. "I once worked for a minor lord's household, tending his horses as much as his people." The name stuck, unfortunately. It was a plausible enough explanation, delivered smoothly, and without hesitation. And yet Elena found herself unable to fully believe it. She thought of the swordsman's precision in the way he had handled the injured guard, the formal old language in the book she had once glimpsed, the vague and shifting answers he gave whenever she asked about his past. Individually, each detail could be explained away. Together, they formed a pattern that refused to settle comfortably in her mind. She chose not to press him further that day. Whatever Julian was hiding, she had learned enough in her strange, repeated life to know that trust, once given, deserved patience in return. If there was a larger truth waiting to be revealed, she believed, foolishly perhaps, that he would tell her when he judged the time was right. She did not yet know how little time remained before the truth would reveal itself without his permission. Prince Adrian's investigation, meanwhile, produced frustratingly little. His steward returned after nearly 2 weeks, with a thin folder of information, most of it vague rumors gathered from travelers and merchants, who claimed to have crossed paths with a healer, answering Julian's description in various distant towns. No records existed of formal medical training, no family connections could be traced. He had simply appeared in Evermore a little over a year ago, and established his small practice with quiet, unremarkable efficiency. A ghost, then, Adrian murmured, unsatisfied. Men without history made him uneasy, particularly men who had somehow captured the attention of a woman he had begun, against his better judgment, to want for himself. He decided, in the careful, patient way that had served him well in matters of both politics and courtship, that if Elena would not come willingly to the palace, he would simply need to give her a reason to return. The reason arrived in the form of a formal invitation delivered to the Whitmore estate a few days later, addressed not to Elena's parents but to Elena herself, requesting her presence at a private audience with the prince regarding, the letter claimed vaguely, matters of importance to the crown. Elena stared at the elegant script for a long moment after her mother handed it to her, triumphant satisfaction written plainly across her face.
"You cannot possibly refuse a direct summons from the prince," her mother said.
"Whatever foolishness you've entertained these past months, this is your chance to correct it." Elena wanted to refuse. Every instinct sharpened by memories of a poisoned wedding night screamed at her to stay as far from Adrian as possible. But a direct summons, delivered formally and witnessed by servants who would surely report her response throughout the city, was not something she could simply ignore without drawing dangerous attention to herself and, by extension, to her family. She went, though every step toward the palace felt like walking backward into a nightmare she had already survived once. Adrian received her in a private garden room, warm with afternoon sunlight and the scent of late-blooming roses. He rose as she entered, his smile easy and disarming, precisely as she remembered from a lifetime she wished she could forget entirely. "Lady Whitmore," he said, "I confess I had begun to wonder if you were avoiding me." "I have simply been occupied, Your Highness," Elena said carefully, keeping her expression polite but distant. "So I've heard," Adrian said, gesturing for her to sit across from him at a small table set with tea and delicate pastries. "A healing house in the lower city, I understand. Quite a departure from palace life." "It suits me," Elena said. "Does it?" Adrian studied her with the same careful attention he might have given a difficult political puzzle, and Elena felt, uncomfortably, that he was searching for weaknesses rather than simply making conversation. "I'll admit, I find myself curious about this healer, who has so thoroughly captured your interest." "Julian Ashworth, was it?" The name in his mouth sent a chill through her, though she kept her hands steady around her teacup. "He is a skilled healer, nothing more." "Perhaps," Adrian said, his tone light but his eyes sharp. "Though it seems no one can quite say where he learned such skill, or where he comes from, before appearing in Evermore, rather suddenly a year ago. Strange, don't you think, for a common healer to be such a mystery?" Elena's grip on the teacup tightened fractionally. "I hadn't thought much about it," she lied. "Perhaps you should," Adrian said, leaning back in his chair with an easy, unhurried confidence that reminded her, painfully, of exactly why she had once found him so captivating, and exactly why that captivation had led her to her death. "I find it wise, in matters of the heart or otherwise, to know precisely who we allow close to us." Elena forced a polite smile, though her mind was racing. Whatever Adrian's true motives for this meeting, whether jealousy, wounded pride, or something colder and more calculated, he had confirmed something she had already begun to suspect on her own. Julian's past held secrets significant enough to draw the attention of a prince's investigators. The audience continued for another half hour, filled with careful, polite conversation that revealed nothing further of importance, and Elena left the palace with her nerves stretched thin, and her thoughts consumed entirely by the mystery she had been trying, perhaps foolishly, to ignore. She returned to the healing house the following morning, determined to finally ask Julian directly what he was hiding, only to find the building's front door locked and a small, hastily written note pinned beside it, called away urgently. "Will return soon." The note was unsigned, but she recognized Julian's careful handwriting from countless prescriptions and instructions he had written for her over the past months. Something about its brevity, its lack of explanation, unsettled her deeply. She waited 3 days before he returned, each of them stretched thin with worry she could not fully explain even to herself. When he finally reappeared, pale and visibly exhausted, with a fresh scrape along his jaw that he claimed came from a fall on a muddy road, Elena found she could no longer stay silent. "Julian," she said, once his first patient of the day had gone, "I need you to tell me the truth. All of it. Who are you, really?" For a long moment, he said nothing, his dark eyes searching her face, as though weighing some difficult decision. Whatever he saw there seemed to settle something in him, though not, apparently, enough to answer. "Elena," he said finally, his voice quiet and tired, in a way that frightened her more than anger would have. "There are things about my past that would put you in danger if you knew them. I am trying to protect you by keeping them hidden, not to deceive you." "I don't want to be protected by secrets," Elena said, frustration and fear tangled together in her chest. "I want to understand who I've spent the last several months trusting with everything." Julian's expression softened, pained and apologetic. "I promise you, when I am able, I will tell you everything. But that time is not yet now. Please, Elena, trust me a little longer." She wanted to argue, wanted to demand answers immediately, but something in his exhausted, earnest expression stopped her. She thought of her own impossible secret, the second life she carried inside her that no one else could ever understand, and found she could not entirely fault him for guarding truths of his own. "A little longer," she agreed finally, though unease settled heavily in her chest as she said it. "But Julian, promise me this much. Whatever danger surrounds your secrets, it will not be allowed to touch the people who care about you." Julian's jaw tightened, and for a fleeting moment, something like guilt crossed his features before he composed himself once more. "I promise I will do everything in my power to keep it that way," he said. It was not the full reassurance she had hoped for, but it was, she suspected, the most honest answer he could give her. She left the healing house that evening with far more questions than answers, and a growing, uneasy certainty that whatever truth Julian was protecting her from, it was drawing closer to the surface with every passing day, whether either of them was ready for it or not. The attack came on a night Elena would never forget, though this time, at least, it was not her own life hanging in the balance. Her father had returned from a council meeting later than usual, his face drawn and thoughtful in a way that made Elena uneasy the moment she saw him cross the threshold. He waved away her questions, claiming only tiredness from a long day of politics, and retreated to his study with a glass of wine he barely touched. It was there, less than an hour later, that a servant found him collapsed on the floor, his breathing shallow, his skin damp with cold sweat. The household dissolved into chaos within minutes. Elena's mother screamed for the family physician. Servants ran in every direction, and Elena herself knelt beside her father on the study floor, pressing trembling fingers to his wrist, exactly as Julian had taught her, feeling his pulse flutter weak and unsteady beneath her fingertips. "Poison," she said aloud, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. She recognized the signs, the same cold sweat and labored breathing that had marked her own final moments in another life, and terror closed around her heart like a fist. The family physician arrived within minutes, an older man well respected among the noble households of Evermore, but even he seemed uncertain, muttering about various possible causes, while Elena's father's breathing grew steadily shallower. Precious time slipped away, as the physician debated treatments, none of which seemed to ease the crisis at all. Elena made her decision in an instant. "Send for Julian Ashworth," she ordered a nearby servant, her voice sharp with a command she had never before used in her own household. "The healer from the lower city. Now. Tell him it's urgent. Tell him it concerns my father, and do not stop for anything until he is standing in this room." Her mother, pale with terror, did not argue. A stable boy was sent racing into the night on the fastest horse in the household, and Elena spent the longest half-hour of her second life kneeling beside her father, whispering useless reassurances while his breath grew fainter beneath her hands. Julian arrived breathless, his hair disheveled, his healer's bag clutched tightly in one hand, having apparently run at least part of the distance from the lower city despite the late hour. He knelt beside Elena's father without hesitation, ignoring the family physician's indignant protests, and began a rapid examination, checking the color beneath her father's fingernails, the dilation of his eyes, the faint bluish tinge already forming around his lips. How long has he been like this? Julian demanded. Less than an hour, Elena said. Julian's expression tightened, grim and focused. This isn't a natural illness. Someone has poisoned him with something designed to work slowly, likely mixed into his wine at the council chambers. I've seen these symptoms before, though rarely, and only in the far eastern provinces. He turned to Elena's mother, his voice firm and commanding despite the urgency written across his face. I need boiled water, clean cloths, and anything made from crushed silverleaf root in your household stores, if you have any. Silverleaf? The family physician scoffed. That's an old wives' remedy, hardly proven. It is the only known counter to this particular poison, Julian snapped, his patience clearly exhausted. If you have a better solution, physician, I invite you to offer it. Otherwise, please step aside. The physician, stunned into silence by the sudden authority in Julian's voice, stepped back without further argument. Elena's mother, understanding only that her husband's life hung by a thread, rushed to search the household stores herself. While they waited, Julian worked with swift, practiced hands, propping her father into a position that eased his labored breathing, applying cool cloths to his fevered skin, murmuring low instructions to Elena about how to monitor his pulse. His movements carried the same precise confidence she had noticed once before, when he had calmed the panicked merchant's guard, and now, watching him fight so fiercely for her father's life, she found she did not care in the slightest what secrets lay behind that skill. She only cared that it was working. The silverleaf root arrived, and Julian crushed it quickly between two stones, mixing the resulting paste with warm water, before carefully coaxing a small amount between her father's lips. The next several minutes stretched agonizingly long, marked only by the ragged sound of her father's breathing and the frantic beating of Elena's own heart. Slowly, gradually, her father's breathing began to ease. The dangerous blue tinge around his lips faded, replaced by a more natural color, and his pulse, when Elena checked it again beneath Julian's careful instruction, grew steadier beneath her fingertips. He'll live, Julian said finally, sitting back on his heels with visible exhaustion, though he'll need days of rest and careful watching. Whatever poison he was given, it was meant to kill slowly, likely to avoid suspicion falling on whoever administered it. Elena's mother wept openly with relief, gathering her still weak but breathing husband into her arms, while Elena herself felt the tension that had gripped her chest for the past hour finally begin to loosen, replaced almost immediately by a colder, more urgent fear. If her father had been deliberately poisoned, it meant someone within the palace or council chambers wished him harm, and that was a danger far from finished. That danger revealed itself only minutes later. A loud crash sounded from the front of the house, followed by the panicked shouts of household guards. Elena rushed toward the noise with Julian close behind her, arriving in the entrance hall just as two men in dark, nondescript clothing forced their way past the struggling household guards, blades drawn, their intentions unmistakable. Finish what was started, one of the intruders growled to the other, his eyes scanning the hall until they landed on Elena's father, still weak and barely conscious in a chair where servants had settled him. Elena froze, terror locking her limbs in place, but Julian moved instantly, placing himself firmly between the intruders and her father's fragile, recovering form. You will not touch him, Julian said, his voice carrying a cold, steady authority that silenced even the household's panicked guards. The first intruder lunged forward with practiced aggression, clearly expecting an easy path past an unarmed healer. What happened next unfolded so quickly that Elena barely had time to process it. Julian sidestepped the attack with fluid, economical movement, catching the man's arm and redirecting his momentum into the nearest wall with enough controlled force to leave him stunned and disarmed without lasting harm. The second intruder hesitated, clearly reassessing the threat standing before him, before attempting his own strike, only to find Julian already moving to counter him with the same startling, practiced precision. Within moments, both intruders lay subdued on the entrance hall floor, disarmed and groaning, while the household guards, recovering from their shock, rushed forward to properly restrain them. Julian stood over the fallen men, breathing hard but otherwise unharmed, his expression unreadable. Elena stared at him, stunned into silence. She had seen glimpses of unusual skill before, small hints she had chosen to overlook, but this was undeniable. No wandering healer, however talented, moved with the trained precision she had just witnessed. This was the fighting skill of someone formerly trained in combat, likely from a very young age, likely by instructors reserved for those of significant importance. "Julian," she said quietly, once the intruders had been dragged away, and the household guards had resumed their positions with grim, alert focus. "Who taught you to fight like that?" He turned to face her, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw something break through his careful, guarded composure. Exhaustion, certainly, but also something that looked remarkably like relief, as though a burden he had carried too long was finally, unavoidably, being set down. "Elena," he said softly, "I think it's time I told you the truth. All of it." Her heart pounded, equal parts fear and anticipation. Whatever truth Julian had been guarding through months of careful evasion and vague explanations, it had just saved her father's life, twice in a single night. First through knowledge no ordinary healer should possess, and then through skill no ordinary healer should have. "I'm listening," she said. But before he could speak further, her mother's voice called urgently from the study, requesting Julian's continued attention, as her father's condition, though improving, still required careful monitoring through the night. Julian's expression flickered with visible frustration at the interruption, but duty won out over revelation. "Tonight, your father needs me more," he said. "But I promise you, Elena, once he is safely past this danger, I will tell you everything. No more evasions. No more half-truths." Elena nodded, though the weight felt unbearable after everything that had just happened. She spent the remainder of that long, exhausting night helping Julian monitor her father's recovery, grinding herbs, changing cloths, watching the steady rise and fall of her father's breathing with fierce, protective vigilance. By the time dawn's pale light crept through the study windows, her father's condition had stabilized fully, his color returned to normal, his breathing deep and even in genuine restorative sleep. Julian finally allowed himself to rest as well, slumping into a chair near the window, his exhaustion plainly visible now that the immediate crisis had passed. Elena sat across from him, too wound up with unanswered questions and lingering fear to feel her own tiredness. "The men who attacked tonight," she said quietly, "they weren't ordinary thieves, were they?" "No," Julian said, his voice heavy. "They were sent, likely by whoever poisoned your father in the first place. Someone wanted him silenced permanently, and when the poison failed to work quickly enough, they sent men to finish the task directly." "Why would anyone want my father dead?" Elena asked, though a cold, creeping suspicion had already begun forming in her mind, one she almost did not want to examine too closely. Julian met her eyes, and something grave and reluctant passed across his features. "That," he said quietly, "is tied to the truth I promised to tell you. I think, Elena, that once you hear it, many things that have confused you these past months will finally make sense." Elena's heart pounded with a mixture of dread and desperate curiosity. Whatever truth waited to be revealed, she sensed it would change everything, not only about the mysterious healer who had become so unexpectedly important to her, but about the dangers now closing in around her own family as well. She reached across the space between them and took his hand, exhausted and unwashed as it was from the night's desperate work, and found she was no longer afraid of whatever secret it carried. "Then tell me," she said softly, "whatever it is, I'm ready." Julian's fingers tightened gently around hers, and for the first time since the night of the ball so many months ago, Elena saw something like true, unguarded relief settle across his exhausted features. "Tomorrow," he promised, "when we are both rested, and somewhere safer than this house, still recovering from tonight's danger. Tomorrow, Elena, you will finally know who I truly am." True to his word, Julian sent a quiet message the following afternoon, asking Elena to meet him, not at the healing house, but at a small chapel garden on the edge of the lower city, a place chosen, she suspected, for its privacy, rather than any particular significance. Her father, still weak but steadily recovering under the watch of household guards, now doubled at every entrance, had insisted she take an escort, and for once, Elena did not argue, though she asked the guards to wait beyond the garden wall so she and Julian could speak alone. He was already there when she arrived, seated on a low stone bench beneath a bare autumn tree, his posture straighter than she had ever seen it, as though he had shed some invisible weight overnight, along with his usual careful humility. When he looked up at her approach, his expression carried none of the guarded evasion she had grown accustomed to. Only quiet, resolved honesty. "Thank you for coming," he said, rising to greet her. "You promised me the truth," Elena said, settling onto the bench beside him, her heart beating fast, despite her attempts to appear calm. "I intend to hold you to it." Julian was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the chapel's weathered stone walls, as though gathering the courage to begin. "My name is Julian," he said finally, "but Ashworth is not truly mine. I was born Julian Fenwick, second son of the royal house of Dravencourt." Elena's breath caught. Dravencourt was Evermore's neighboring kingdom, a proud and ancient realm, whose royal family she had heard mentioned only in passing. In the careful, distant way nobles discussed foreign courts they had little direct dealing with. "A prince," she said slowly, the word feeling strange and enormous in the quiet garden air. "You've been a prince this entire time." "Not exactly," Julian said, a trace of bitterness entering his voice. "Or rather, not for the past 2 years. When I was younger, my mother, who was queen, held significant influence at court, more than my father's other wife and her supporters were ever comfortable with. There were always tensions, always factions maneuvering for advantage, though as a boy I understood little of it, beyond the occasional strained dinner or whispered argument behind closed doors." He paused, his hands clasped tightly together, and Elena reached over instinctively to rest her hand against his arm, a small gesture of support that seemed to steady him enough to continue. "2 years ago, those tensions finally broke into open conflict," Julian continued. "My father's health had been failing for some time, and as his strength weakened, the factions opposing my mother's influence saw their opportunity. They moved against the palace in a single, coordinated strike, timed for a night when most of the loyal guard had been deliberately reassigned, elsewhere on false orders. My mother was killed before I even understood what was happening. My father survived, only because he was already so weakened that his enemies believed him no longer a threat worth eliminating directly, choosing instead to keep him as a controlled figurehead." Elena's grip on his arm tightened, horror and sympathy tangled together in her chest. "Julian, I'm so sorry. I barely escaped myself," he said quietly, his voice carrying the flat, careful tone of someone who had recounted painful memories enough times to build walls around the rawest edges of the pain. Though those walls, Elena could see, remained thin and fragile beneath the surface. "A loyal guard captain, a man who had served my mother faithfully for years, smuggled me out through a servant's passage as the palace fell into chaos around us. He believed, correctly, that whoever had orchestrated the coup would want me dead as well, to eliminate any future claim I might make to challenge their control. And so you fled," Elena said softly. "I fled," Julian confirmed, "across the border into Evermore, disguising myself as a common traveler, eventually settling here, under a false name, using the medical training my mother had insisted I receive as a child, believing every noble child, prince or otherwise, should understand how to care for the sick and injured. I never imagined that training would become the very thing keeping me fed and sheltered in exile." Elena thought of the countless small mysteries that had surrounded him since their first meeting, the swordsman's precision in his movements, the formal old language in his hidden book, likely some royal text from Dravencourt, the scarred stranger who had called him my lord in careful, hushed tones. All of it fit now, clicking into place with a clarity that left her both relieved and deeply unsettled. "The man I saw you speaking with, weeks ago," she said, "the scarred stranger." "Captain Aldrich," Julian confirmed. "The same guard who helped me escape the coup. He has remained loyal these past 2 years, gathering information about the situation in Dravencourt whenever he can, passing it along to me during his occasional visits. He came recently to warn me that my father's health has worsened significantly, and that the faction controlling the throne grows increasingly desperate to eliminate any remaining threat to their power, myself included, before my father's death makes their position more precarious." "Is that why my father was attacked?" Elena asked, a cold, dawning realization settling over her. "Because of you?" Julian's expression filled with visible guilt. "I believe so, though I cannot yet prove it directly. My presence in Evermore was meant to remain a well-guarded secret. If someone from Dravencourt discovered where I was hiding, and further discovered my growing closeness with a prominent noble family, They may have decided that removing your father served two purposes at once: eliminating a respected voice on Evermore's council who might otherwise offer me sanctuary or support if my identity became known, and sending a clear warning to me that nowhere I hide is truly safe. Elena absorbed this in heavy silence, the pieces of recent danger arranging themselves into a far more frightening picture than she had initially understood. Her father's poisoning had not been random misfortune. It had been a calculated strike, connected directly to the man sitting beside her now, a man she had spent months slowly falling for, believing him nothing more than a humble, kind healer with an admirably simple life. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she asked, though the question carried more sorrow than accusation. "Because I was afraid," Julian admitted, his voice raw with an honesty she suspected cost him considerable effort. "Afraid that revealing the truth would drive you away, certainly. But more than that, afraid of exactly what happened last night. I did not want to draw you or your family into danger that rightfully belongs only to me. I told myself that keeping my identity hidden protected you. I see now that it only delayed a danger that was always destined to find its way to you eventually, so long as I remained close to you." Elena considered this, weighing her lingering hurt at months of careful evasion against the clear, painful logic behind his silence. She thought of her own impossible secret, the second life she had never spoken of to anyone, and understood, more than most people ever could, the particular loneliness of carrying a truth too dangerous or too strange to share. "I understand why you hid it," she said finally. "I'm not certain I fully forgive the silence. Not yet, but I understand it." Relief flickered across Julian's face, quickly tempered by continued worry. "There is more you should know," he said. "Something that concerns your family's safety more directly." "Tell me," Elena said, bracing herself. "Captain Aldrich believes the attack on your father was likely arranged in cooperation with someone here in Evermore," Julian said grimly. "Someone with enough influence and information to know precisely how to strike at your household, and precisely when your father's council duties would leave him vulnerable to poisoning." "A traitor within our own court," Elena said slowly, her mind already racing through the possibilities, though one name rose immediately, unwelcome and impossible to ignore. "Perhaps," Julian said carefully, "though I have no proof of who, specifically." Elena thought of Adrian's pointed questions during their private audience weeks earlier, his careful, probing curiosity about Julian's mysterious past, his barely concealed frustration at her continued absence from palace life. She thought, too, of the poisoned wine that had ended her first life, delivered on her own wedding night by a man she had trusted completely. "I think I might have some idea," she said quietly. Julian's expression sharpened with immediate concern. "Elena, if you suspect someone specific, you must tell me. This is far too dangerous for guesswork or hesitation." "Prince Adrian," Elena said, the name feeling heavier now than it ever had before. "He has shown considerable, unusual interest in learning about you. And he has—" She hesitated, uncertain how to explain a suspicion rooted in a life Julian knew nothing about. "He has never struck me as someone whose charm runs as deep as it appears." Julian's jaw tightened. If Prince Adrian is connected to the faction controlling Dravencourt, or if he simply saw an opportunity to remove a rival for your attention, while weakening a council member who might oppose him politically, it would explain a great deal. But Elena, accusing a prince without solid proof is enormously dangerous, both for you and for your family. "I know," Elena said, "which is why we need proof before we can act." They spent the remainder of that afternoon in careful, quiet discussion, piecing together fragments of information, weighing possibilities, and slowly forming the beginnings of a plan, neither of them yet fully understood the shape of. Julian revealed that Captain Aldrich remained in the city, gathering what information he could about any recent correspondence or unusual activity connecting Dravencourt's ruling faction to Evermore's court. As the sun began sinking toward the horizon, painting the chapel garden in soft amber light, Elena found herself studying Julian's face, searching for the prince now visible beneath the humble healer she had first grown to trust. The transformation, she realized slowly, changed remarkably little about how she felt toward him. If anything, understanding the weight of loss and danger he had carried silently for 2 years only deepened her admiration for the quiet, steady kindness he had continued offering everyone around him despite it. "Julian," she said softly, "or should I call you something else now?" A small, tired smile crossed his face, the first genuine warmth she had seen since their conversation began. "Julian is fine," he said. "It's who I've chosen to be these past 2 years, regardless of the title I was born with. Perhaps it's who I'd like to remain, if circumstances ever allow it." "Whoever you are," Elena said, "prince or healer or both, I'm glad you finally trusted me with the truth." "I should have trusted you sooner," Julian said. "You've proven yourself far braver and steadier than most people I've known in either life." Elena felt warmth rise in her cheeks despite the seriousness surrounding them. "What happens now?" she asked. "If Dravencourt's ruling faction knows you're here, if they're willing to strike at my family to reach you, this danger won't simply disappear." Julian's expression grew resolute, the careful weariness of exile replaced by something firmer, more determined. "Now," he said, "I stop hiding. 2 years of caution kept me alive, but it has done nothing to protect the people I care about, and clearly nothing to discourage my enemies from striking regardless. If they intend to hunt me, regardless of how carefully I hide, I would rather face them directly than continue endangering everyone around me through silence." "That could be enormously dangerous," Elena said, worry tightening in her chest. "It could," Julian agreed. "But continuing to hide has already proven dangerous as well, only without any chance of resolving the true threat. I would rather face danger with a clear plan than continue waiting for it to strike unexpectedly at those I love." The word love hung between them, quiet and unplanned, and Elena felt her heart skip at the simple honesty of it. Julian seemed to realize what he'd said a moment later, a faint flush rising in his cheeks, despite the day's serious tone. "I meant," he began. "I know what you meant," Elena said softly, reaching over to take his hand once more. "And I feel the same." For a brief, quiet moment, the weight of coups and poisonings and hidden identities faded into the background, leaving only two people who had found, against every unlikely circumstance, something steady and real between them. It would not last long, Elena knew, with danger still circling close and unresolved. But for that single moment in the fading autumn light, she allowed herself simply to feel grateful for the truth finally spoken, and for the man sitting beside her who had chosen honesty despite every reason for continued fear. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers to face and unravel. Tonight, at least, the secrets between them had finally come into the light, and whatever came next, they would face it together. Captain Aldrich returned to the city 3 days later, with information that confirmed their worst suspicions, delivered in a hushed meeting at the healing house after hours, the windows shuttered and the door barred against unwanted listeners. He had intercepted a letter, carried by a Dravencourt messenger, intercepted along the border road, written in a careful, coded hand, but unmistakably addressed to a contact within Evermore's own palace. "The letter references payment for services already rendered," Aldrich said grimly, spreading the recovered document across the healing house's wooden table, "and promises further reward once the second attempt succeeds where the first failed. It does not name Lord Whitmore directly, but the timing matches precisely with the poisoning attempt on his life." "Who was it addressed to?" Elena asked, dread coiling tight in her stomach. Aldrich hesitated, glancing briefly at Julian before answering. "The letter was addressed using only a coded designation, my lady, not a name. But the wax seal used to close it bears a mark I recognize. It belongs to a merchant house here in Evermore, known to handle discreet financial matters for several members of the royal court, including, on more than one occasion, Prince Adrian himself." The confirmation, though not absolute proof, settled like ice through Elena's veins. She had suspected Adrian's involvement from the moment Julian first described the attack's likely motive, but hearing it laid out so plainly, connected through careful investigation, rather than mere instinct and painful memory, made the danger feel suddenly, urgently real. "This still isn't enough to accuse a prince openly," Julian said, studying the coded letter with a frown. "Suspicion and circumstantial connections won't stand against a member of the royal family, not without far stronger proof." "Then we need stronger proof," Elena said, steel entering her voice despite the fear still coiled tightly in her chest. "Whatever it takes." They spent the following days working carefully, cautiously, gathering what additional evidence they could, without drawing dangerous attention to themselves. Aldrich used his careful network of contacts to trace the merchant house's recent transactions, uncovering a pattern of unusually large payments moved through several disguised accounts over the past 2 months, timed suspiciously close to both the poisoning attempt and the assassin's subsequent attack on the Whitmore household. Meanwhile, Elena's father, recovering steadily under continued careful watch, proved an unexpectedly valuable ally once informed, in careful, measured terms, of the danger surrounding his family. Though shocked by the revelation of Julian's true identity, and initially wary of the danger such a connection might bring, Lord Whitmore possessed decades of experience navigating Evermore's political currents, and he brought that experience fully to bear once convinced of the threat's seriousness. "If Prince Adrian believes himself untouchable," he said during a quiet, careful family council held in his recovering chambers, "then our best chance lies in exposing him publicly, before witnesses whose testimony he cannot easily dismiss or silence. A private accusation would simply disappear, along with anyone foolish enough to make it. A public one, presented with proper evidence before the full royal council, would force even the crown to acknowledge what has happened." "The council meets again in 5 days," Elena's mother added, her earlier disapproval of Julian entirely replaced by fierce, protective determination now that her husband's life had been directly threatened. "If we can gather sufficient proof before then, we could present our case directly, with the full weight of witnesses and documentation behind us." The plan carried enormous risk. Publicly accusing a prince of orchestrating both poisoning and assassination attempts, without absolute, undeniable proof, could easily backfire, drawing devastating retaliation down upon the entire Whitmore family, and upon Julian himself, whose hidden identity would become impossible to conceal, once exposed to such intense scrutiny. And yet, as Julian pointed out during one of their many late-night planning sessions, continuing to hide offered no true safety either, only a slower, more uncertain path toward eventual disaster. "We need something undeniable," Julian said, pacing the healing house's small back room, while Elena and Aldrich reviewed their gathered evidence once more. "Financial records and coincidental timing will raise suspicion, certainly, but Adrian could easily claim innocence, could easily produce alternative explanations for merchant transactions that seem damning to us, but might appear ordinary to a council eager to protect their prince." "What about a confession?" Elena asked suddenly. "From one of the men who attacked my father's household. They were captured, weren't they? Surely, given proper questioning, one of them might reveal who ordered the attack." Aldrich's expression turned thoughtful. "It's possible, though men hired for such dangerous work are often paid, precisely because they can be trusted to remain silent, even under considerable pressure." "Then we find their weakness," Julian said. "Everyone has one." It took 2 more days of careful, patient work, coordinated between Aldrich's contacts within the city guard and Elena's own quiet visits to the holding cells where the captured assassins remained imprisoned, but eventually their persistence yielded results. The younger of the 2 attackers, a man barely past 20 years old and clearly more desperate than dangerous, finally broke under the weight of his own fear, confessing in exchange for promised leniency that he and his companion had been hired through an intermediary connected to the same merchant house Aldrich had already identified, and that the intermediary had made clear, in careful but unmistakable terms, that the true patron behind their payment held significant influence at the royal palace itself. It was not a direct confession naming Adrian specifically. The intermediary had been careful enough to keep his employer's identity concealed even from the men he hired. But combined with the financial records, the timing, and the merchant house's known connections to the prince, it formed a chain of evidence substantial enough, Lord Whitmore judged, to bring formally before the full royal council. The morning of the council meeting arrived cold and clear, the palace hall filled with nobles and officials gathered to discuss matters of trade and border security. Entirely unaware of the confrontation about to unfold, Elena stood beside her father, dressed formally but simply, her heart pounding as they waited for their opportunity to speak. Julian remained nearby, dressed for the first time since she had known him in clothing that carried faint echoes of his true royal heritage, subtle but unmistakable to anyone who understood such details. A decision made deliberately to lend weight to the testimony he would soon offer. King Aldous, Evermore's elderly ruler, presided over the council from his elevated seat, Prince Adrian seated at his right hand, apparently at ease amid the routine business of governance. Elena watched him carefully, as her father requested formal permission to address a matter of grave importance to the crown, noting the brief flicker of surprise, quickly masked, that crossed Adrian's face, as her father's request was granted. Lord Whitmore laid out their evidence methodically, careful and precise, despite the enormity of the accusation building beneath his words. He described the poisoning attempt on his own life, the subsequent assassination attack on his household, the financial trail connecting hired assassins to a merchant house known for handling discreet transactions on behalf of certain palace figures, and finally, the young attacker's confession regarding an intermediary connected to that same house. Murmurs of shock rippled through the assembled council as the implications became clear, though Lord Whitmore was careful, even now, not to name Adrian directly, allowing the evidence itself to build toward its own inevitable conclusion. "This is a serious accusation," King Aldous said finally, his weathered face grave, "though I note you have not yet named who you believe responsible for ordering these attacks against you. Because the evidence, while substantial, remains circumstantial regarding the final identity of whoever ordered these crimes," Lord Whitmore said carefully. "However, I believe there is one more piece of testimony that may clarify matters considerably." He gestured toward Julian, who stepped forward with quiet, steady composure, despite the weight of every eye in the hall now turning toward him. "Your Majesty," Julian said, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent hall, "my name is not Julian Ashworth, as I have been known these past 2 years in Evermore's lower city. My true name is Julian Fenwick, second son of the royal house of Dravencourt, believed by most to have perished during the coup that claimed my mother's life 2 years ago." The revelation sent a fresh wave of shocked murmurs through the assembled nobles, King Aldous himself leaning forward with visible astonishment. Prince Adrian's careful composure cracked, just briefly, into something sharper and more alarmed, before he smoothed it away. "I have lived quietly in hiding since that coup," Julian continued, "believing my continued survival depended entirely on remaining unknown to those who orchestrated my mother's death and now controlled Dravencourt's throne through my weakened father. Recently, however, I received warning through a trusted contact that agents connected to that same faction had discovered my location here in Evermore and intended to eliminate any threat I might pose, along with anyone who had shown me kindness or support during my exile." He turned his gaze deliberately toward Prince Adrian, who sat rigid and pale in his seat beside the king. "I believe the attacks against Lord Whitmore's household were intended precisely for this purpose, orchestrated through cooperation between Dravencourt's ruling faction and someone here in Evermore's own court, someone with both the influence to arrange such attacks discreetly and the motive to eliminate a family that had shown me unexpected friendship." "This is absurd," Adrian said sharply, rising from his seat, his composure finally fracturing under the weight of the assembled hall's suspicious attention. "You expect this council to believe the word of a stranger, claiming royal blood, with no proof beyond his own testimony?" "There is proof, Your Highness," Aldrich said, stepping forward from where he had remained quietly near the hall's entrance, producing the intercepted coded letter and laying it before the king. "This letter, intercepted along the border road, bears the seal of a merchant house known to handle discreet financial matters for several court figures, including, on more than one documented occasion, yourself." King Aldous examined the letter with grave, careful attention, his expression darkening as he studied the coded contents and the unmistakable seal pressed into its wax closure. "Explain this seal, Adrian," he said finally, his voice carrying a coldness Elena had never before heard directed at his son. "I have used that merchant house for various legitimate transactions," Adrian said, though his voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. "That proves nothing beyond ordinary commerce." "Perhaps," King Aldous said, "though combined with the timing of these attacks, and a confession already given by one of the captured assassins regarding an intermediary connected to precisely this merchant house, I find myself considerably less inclined toward such an innocent explanation." The hall fell into tense, expectant silence as Adrian's composure crumbled further under the combined weight of evidence and his father's visible, growing suspicion. Elena watched, her heart pounding, as the careful, charming mask she remembered so vividly from her first life finally began slipping away entirely, revealing something colder and more desperate beneath. Whatever alliance you sought with Dravencourt's ruling faction, Julian said quietly into the tense silence, whatever advantage you believed it might offer you, it has cost an innocent family their safety, and very nearly cost Lord Whitmore his life. I would ask this council to consider carefully what such willingness to endanger innocent lives reveals about a man's fitness to one day rule this kingdom. Adrian's eyes flashed with sudden, uncontrolled fury, and for a brief, dangerous moment, Elena feared he might attempt something reckless within the very halls of the council itself. But the weight of the assembled nobles' suspicious, watchful attention, combined with his own father's grave, disapproving gaze, seemed finally to convince him that no further denial would salvage his position. "You cannot prove I ordered anything directly," Adrian said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Perhaps not with absolute certainty," King Aldous said heavily, "though the evidence presented here today casts more than sufficient doubt upon your conduct to warrant a full and formal investigation, conducted independently of your own influence over the Crown's usual proceedings. Until that investigation concludes, you will be relieved of your council duties and confined to the eastern wing of the palace under guard." The declaration sent a fresh wave of stunned murmurs through the hall, and Adrian, recognizing the finality in his father's tone, offered no further protest beyond a final, furious glance directed toward Elena and Julian, before allowing palace guards to escort him from the chamber. The investigation that followed over the subsequent weeks confirmed what the council's initial evidence had only suggested. Adrian, driven by wounded pride at Elena's rejection and genuine political ambition to weaken Dravencourt's current rulers in exchange for future favor, once their control solidified, had indeed arranged both the poisoning and the subsequent assassination attempt, believing the connection would never be traced back to him with sufficient certainty to matter. He was formally stripped of his succession rights and confined under permanent guard, his ambitions for the throne ended entirely by his own reckless cruelty. For Julian, the revelation of his survival, combined with growing unrest among Dravencourt's own people against the faction that had seized their throne through violence, opened an unexpected path forward. With King Aldis's cautious support and Captain Aldrich's careful coordination with loyalist forces still remaining within Dravencourt itself, Julian began the long, difficult process of reclaiming his rightful place, not through force, but through careful alliance building and the slow restoration of trust among nobles who had once served his mother faithfully. Elena stood beside him through every difficult step of that process, no longer simply a noblewoman with an unusual fondness for medicine, but a partner fully invested in the dangerous, uncertain work of righting a great injustice. Her parents, initially wary of the danger such involvement might bring, came to support the match fully once the truth of Adrian's treachery made clear exactly how close their family had come to losing everything, through association with the wrong prince entirely. "I never imagined," Lord Whitmore admitted to Elena one quiet evening, watching his daughter help Julian review correspondence from Dravencourt's loyalist nobles, "that the healer you insisted on helping at that ball would prove to be exactly the ally this family needed most." "Neither did I," Elena admitted, though the words carried no regret at all. "I only knew, from the very beginning, that he was someone worth trusting." It would take many more months before Julian's claim to Dravencourt's throne could be fully secured, and Elena knew the road ahead remained uncertain, filled with political maneuvering, and lingering danger from those still loyal to the faction that had seized power through violence. But for the first time since waking into her second chance at life, she felt genuinely certain of the path she had chosen, certain in a way her first life's dazzling infatuation with Adrian's charm had never truly allowed. She had chosen, in the end, not a prince's polished charm, but a healer's quiet, steady kindness, and found, to her great and lasting relief, that the two were not so separate after all. Julian remained, beneath every layer of royal blood and political necessity, the same patient, gentle man who had once taught her to grind chamomile and set a simple splint, who had run breathless through the night to save her father's life, who had chosen honesty over continued safety the moment it truly mattered. Whatever challenges still lay ahead, Elena faced them now without the fear that had once defined her first unlived future. She had broken free of a fate that ended in betrayal and poison, and built, in its place, a life grounded in trust freely given and steadily earned. Spring arrived in Evermore with unusual gentleness that year, warming the gardens Elena had once walked through in fear and uncertainty, into something bright and full of quiet promise. The healing house in the lower city still stood, its shelves still stocked with dried herbs and folded bandages, though Julian visited less often now, his days increasingly consumed by the careful, patient work of securing Dravencourt's throne. Elena had taken on much of the daily healing work herself, trained now with skill enough to manage most ordinary complaints without assistance, calling on Julian only for the rare cases that truly demanded his particular expertise. The transition of power in Dravencourt had not come without difficulty. The faction that had seized control through violence 2 years earlier did not surrender their advantage easily, and for several tense months, Elena had watched Julian carry the weight of careful negotiations, secret alliances, and the constant, gnawing fear of betrayal from within his own remaining supporters. Captain Aldrich had proven invaluable throughout, his years of quiet loyalty finally rewarded with a position of genuine trust and authority, as Julian slowly rebuilt a network of nobles willing to support his rightful claim. The final resolution had come not through open conflict, which Julian had worked tirelessly to avoid, understanding all too well the cost such violence would extract from ordinary people who had already suffered enough under the current faction's harsh rule. Instead, it came through the slow, patient exposure of the ruling faction's own corruption and cruelty, revealed gradually through careful investigation and testimony gathered by loyalists still embedded within Dravencourt's court. Faced with mounting evidence of their crimes and dwindling support even among their own allies, the faction's leadership eventually agreed to a negotiated transfer of power, rather than risk the total collapse of their position through open rebellion. Julian's father, weakened by years of illness and grief, lived just long enough to witness his son's rightful restoration before passing peacefully, finally freed from the careful, watchful captivity the coup's leaders had kept him under. Julian mourned him quietly, grieving not only the loss itself, but the 2 years of separation that could never be recovered, though Elena remained steadily by his side throughout, offering the same quiet, patient support he had once offered her family during their own darkest hour. The formal coronation, when it finally came, was a considerably smaller and more solemn affair than palace tradition typically demanded, reflecting Julian's own quiet preferences, even now that circumstance had returned him fully to his royal position. Elena stood among the witnesses, her heart full of pride and relief in equal measure, watching the man she had once known only as a humble, hungry healer accept the crown that had always, rightfully, belonged to him. Their own wedding followed some months later, held not in Dravencourt's grand palace, but in the quiet chapel garden, where Julian had first revealed his true identity to her. A choice both of them agreed carried far more meaning than any grander setting could offer. Elena wore a simple gown, green rather than the elaborate white and gold she remembered, with painful clarity, from a wedding day, in another life that had ended in betrayal and death. This time, the wine served at the celebration carried no hidden poison, only genuine joy, shared among family and the small, loyal circle of friends who had supported them through every danger along the way. Life as Dravencourt's queen proved considerably different from anything Elena had once imagined for herself, whether in her original life or her strange, unexpected second chance. She continued her medical work whenever possible, establishing a healing house within the palace grounds itself, training a small staff of dedicated healers to serve both nobility and common folk alike, insisting, as Julian always had, that care should never depend on a patient's ability to pay. Julian, for his part, ruled with the same patient, careful thoughtfulness he had once brought to treating a stranger's fever, earning, slowly but steadily, the genuine trust and affection of a people who had suffered greatly under the previous faction's harsh, self-serving rule. Prince Adrian's fate, meanwhile, played out quietly over the following year. Stripped permanently of his succession rights and confined under careful guard, he remained in Evermore's palace as a diminished, largely forgotten figure, his ambitions for both the throne and Elena's affection equally and permanently extinguished. Elena felt, when she thought of him at all, not the lingering fear that had once haunted her every memory of her first life's tragic end, but only a distant, settled relief that she had recognized the danger in time to choose a different path entirely. Her own family flourished under the renewed strength of their alliance with Dravencourt's restored crown. Lord Whitmore, fully recovered from the poisoning that had so nearly claimed his life, became a valued advisor in the careful diplomatic relationship now growing steadily between Evermore and its neighboring kingdom, his experience and wisdom proving invaluable during the delicate early years of Julian's reign. Elena's mother, once so determined to see her daughter married into royal power through Adrian's charm, found instead a genuine, unexpected joy in her daughter's real happiness. A happiness built not on political advantage but on trust, partnership, and shared purpose. Elena often found herself, in quiet moments during those first peaceful years, reflecting on the strange, impossible gift of her second chance. She had been given the rare, terrible knowledge of exactly how her first life had ended, betrayed and poisoned by a man whose charm had blinded her to his true nature, until it was far too late to escape. That knowledge had driven her, in this new life, toward caution and fear at first, a desperate desire simply to avoid repeating the same mistake. What she had found instead, in her determination to walk a different path, was something she could never have predicted or planned for. A genuine partnership, built not on the dazzling, dangerous charm that had once captivated her so completely, but on patience, honesty, and the quiet, steady courage of a man willing to risk everything, including his own carefully guarded safety, to protect the people he cared about. She thought, sometimes, of that first terrible night in her original life, the poisoned wine slipping from her fingers, the cold shock of betrayal spreading through her chest alongside the poison itself. She no longer felt the sharp, immediate terror that memory had once carried. Instead, she felt only a quiet, grateful acknowledgement of how far she had traveled since then, and how completely different a life could become, when built on trust, genuinely earned, rather than charm carelessly given. Julian, for his part, often told her that her simple, unplanned kindness, that first night at the ball, the willingness to kneel beside a stranger in the dirt, rather than hurry past toward more important company, had changed the entire course of his own future, as thoroughly as it had changed hers. He had arrived in Evermore 2 years earlier believing himself permanently alone, a prince without a kingdom, a man without a true home, surviving through careful anonymity and quiet, guarded distance from anyone who might discover his dangerous secret. Elena's simple, unhesitating compassion had been the first crack in those careful walls, the beginning of a trust he had never expected to find again after losing his mother and his kingdom in a single, violent night. That trust, built slowly and carefully across months of shared work and quiet honesty, had ultimately given him the courage to finally reveal his true identity, first to her, and eventually to the world, reclaiming a birthright he might otherwise have abandoned entirely out of fear and grief. Their partnership, forged through danger and careful honesty rather than easy charm, proved remarkably resilient through the ordinary challenges that followed in the years after Julian's restoration. They faced political disputes, occasional lingering resistance from nobles still loyal to the old faction, and the countless small difficulties that came with building a genuinely fair and compassionate rule after years of harsh, self-interested governance. Through each challenge, they relied on the same patient, steady partnership that had first brought them together, Elena's practical wisdom and medical skill complementing Julian's careful, thoughtful leadership in ways that steadily strengthened both the kingdom and their own bond. Years later, when their own children asked how their parents had first met, Elena would tell them, with a small private smile, about a ragged, exhausted healer who had collapsed at a palace gate, and a young noblewoman who had knelt beside him in the dirt, rather than walk past toward a prince's dazzling smile. She never told them the full truth of her strange second chance, that impossible knowledge of a life once lived and lost, choosing instead to let the story stand simply as what it had genuinely become, a tale of two people who had found, against every unlikely circumstance, a partnership built on kindness freely given, and trust patiently, steadily earned. It was, she often reflected, a far better story than the one she had originally been destined to live, and she remained, every single day, deeply and quietly grateful for the second chance that had allowed her to choose it.